I am really fired up for today's conversation. I've been hosting Resilient for the last 3 years. I actually began to think it was like 2.5 years, but I actually think it's like 3.5 years, 2016, which is incredible that I've been doing this long. But we're going to do something different today. To kick off National Cyber Security Awareness Month, I am passing the microphone to my partner and good friend, Deb Golden, to do a Chief Information Security Officer leadership series. And even if you're not in the CISO role, we all know that cyber really is the defining risk of our time. And I think anybody that listens to this, especially when you hear Deb, is going to get a lot from these leader insights. Today, I'm going to be introducing you to Deb, who is an incredible leader, but I think what you're going to hear, she's even a better person. We're going to talk about a lot of things, including cyber everywhere, where cyber is just not in the IT system, it's everywhere. We're going to be talking about risk-based approach to cyber. There's just so many things you could tackle. You can't tackle them all. So focus on a risk-based approach. And I think what I'm most excited about is to talk to her about authentic leadership. That's the one thing, knowing Deb for many, many years, is that she is one of the most authentic people. And to have risen to this leadership position where she's overseen all cyber-related services for Deloitte is just incredible.
So, this is going to sound really corny, but it really is everywhere. And so when you think about what that means, so where we are in today's day and age with mobility, if you will, nothing is constrained, if you will, within the four walls.
Welcome to Resilient, where we hear from resilient leaders who share real insights through unfiltered stories. Normally, I jump on a plane, but today you're probably going to hear a bit of difference because I am doing this virtually. So there may be some differences in sound quality, but that's so that we can do more of these conversations so that we can bring real time the information that you need. My hope is that you're going to find during today's conversation a nugget or two that you can take away. And like I said, at the very least, you're going to hear from an incredible leader who's leading the way on cyber at Deloitte. So with that, let's get to my conversation with Deb Golden. Deb Golden, welcome to Resilient.
Thanks for having me, Mike. Happy to be here today.
It's awesome. I'm actually really been looking forward to this. So Deb, you have this fancy new role at Deloitte, which we will absolutely get into. But I think the last time I saw you when we were in DC, we were in a meeting and you were joined by a little friend, a dog at that time you were training. And I've come to learn that this is actually a passion for you in your life beyond your cyber leadership role. So maybe if you could just start there around why are you so passionate about dogs and training? What's beneath that?
Yeah, happy to. Always brings a smile to my face when we're talking about dogs. So specifically, I just, I've always wanted to be able to give back to the community and be able to help people perhaps, have things and live better lives than perhaps otherwise the situations would avail. And candidly, I've always wanted to help serve with a guide dog. And after about a year of getting certified, I'm now an official certified service dog trainer. And the one that you saw me with, his name was Cedar. I'm happy to announce that Cedar is now 16 months old, and he's in what we'll call college in Long Island, New York, training to be a PTSD dog. He's actually currently undergoing nightmare training, and hopefully he'll be able to graduate soon. So if you see me around, I've got another new one. His name is Todd, and Todd came to me at 7 weeks, and currently he's 16 weeks old, and I'll also be training him probably for the next 12 to 14 months, hopefully to quote unquote go to college as well, where they receive a little bit of extra training in college and then get placed with their clients. So I'm super excited, and like I said, the ability to be able to give back, to have people lead, better lives, a higher quality life with the purpose of a service dog is incredibly special to me. So I'm just happy to be able to help in that capacity.
Is there, beyond just kind of doing good, is there any kind of deeper learnings that you've had from the experience?
Yeah, interestingly, yes. So everything from, just what you don't see or know, and obviously learning them from the eyes of the service dog. And that sounds maybe strange if you've never had a service dog, but things like taking a train. The dogs come with me everywhere. They go to work with me. They travel with me, planes, trains, and automobiles. And I'm sure everybody's seen on the train the watch the gap, right? So the gap between the train and the platform. Well, you might not think twice about it other than it always says watch the gap, but the dogs have to watch the gap. And so how do you help to train the dog so that if they're with a blind individual or wheelchair enabled individual, that they actually know how to watch the gap, which again, I would have probably never thought about or thought twice about. And then also just, daily goings about your business and how much you rely on sight and sound and being able to move through society. So it's been a great learning experience for me. It's been a great learning experience to bond with others who rely so much on these service animals. It's amazing to think about the number of people who need service animals is extremely large. There's not enough dogs and there's not enough trainers. So like I said, to be able to see that impact on individuals' lives is not only been just totally grateful from my perspective, but just also humbling to understand and to learn a little bit more from the vantage point of the dog.
So Deb, tell us a bit about yourself. And one of the things before we get into the heavier questions, I think it's always important for people to get to know the guest, to go a little deeper on kind of who you are. So where did you grow up? Who were some of your early influences?
So grew up in New York and Virginia. Predominantly, my father was the CIO of a defense contractor for 35 years. He worked for the same company for 35 years, but towards the end of his career, led their IT division and split his time between Massachusetts and Virginia. And so while I didn't travel, he traveled quite a bit in between locations. And one of the things, due to his job and his commitment to that company, always grew up with technology in the household. So we were one of the first families on the block with a Wang computer or an Apple computer back in the day. I'm dating myself with the Wang computer, but even before that, with satellite surface radar, was one of the things that my father was testing in his early days in his career, and just having the technology in the house candidly was the earliest influence that I've had in my life. And one of the things that was always influential is my dad liked to bring these gadgets home, but he never brought home any of the manuals. And so he told us we were all allowed to play with them. My sister and I, she's 5 years older than I am, we're allowed to play with them, but that we didn't have any books. We couldn't figure them out other than playing with it. And so we would basically just play with the technology until they started to ding, and still they started to do things. And so really just grew up from childhood learning to tinker and wanting to understand how things worked. And I really candidly have him to thank for that in terms of my interest in both technology and ultimately, obviously, in the field of cyber.
That is really cool. It's almost like he gave you license to pull it apart, which most parents say don't do.
It really was. And again, not to date myself too much, but the video games back then where you actually had to write commands. So we had to, say walk 10 feet to the left, turn right. And so it was funny because you had without a manual or without knowing or without seeing friends, it's not like everyone on the block had one. And so you really had to have the interest. And I just thrived to always figure out how things worked. And so for me, it gave me continuing desire and energy. And of course, I wanted to keep playing the video game. And so the only way to keep playing the video game at the time was to figure out how to basically work the program. And now that I think about it, I mean, that was true programming 101 back in the day. And so again, I really do credit my dad with getting me into the technology geek, kind of widgety type of activity in terms of trying to understand the mechanics behind everything.
Yeah, it's awesome to hear the impact that your parents can have on you. And I always think about that with my kids. It's like, am I actually having an impact? And obviously he did with you. It's funny too, because my wife and I were sitting around last night talking about our Apple IIes when we were growing up, and remember Turtle? Yeah. So I think I'm dating myself as well. So Deb, now you're the leader of cyber at Deloitte. And there's a lot of conversation, obviously, even beyond Deloitte, about women in technology. What does it mean for you to take on this new role? Or maybe it doesn't mean a whole lot. Like, one of the things I think that stands out about you is you truly are an individual and authentic, but have you reflected on kind of the impact that you're making on other women and what it means to you taking on this new significant role within Deloitte?
Yeah, and it's something that I've thought about candidly quite some time over the length of my career, mainly because I think when I was younger, and whether that was, college or even at the start of my career here at Deloitte and been here for quite some time, I always thought of myself like I don't ever want to be a role model. And it's not because I don't aspire to be things that are aspirational for other individuals or empowering to other individuals. I kind of always just thought, you know what, do good things, keep your head down, be honest, be authentic, be yourself, and good things will come to you. And what I've realized over time is the amount of people that you draw, and not only to me, but that I draw and can learn from others. And so over the years, I've really given this a lot of thought of how proud I am to be a role model in this situation, not because I'm the best at what I do, but because I embrace the fact that we do need role models. And in this situation, females in cyber, in technology, in terms of authentic and transparent leaders, whether female or male, when we look at how I strive to lead the practice and just lead my authentic self. I mean, I know I've said that word a couple of times. Authenticity and transparency to me are just incredibly just foundational to who I am. And I do believe that even in hard times and hard conversations, putting yourself out and perhaps being a little bit more vulnerable than perhaps you normally would really establishes yourself and who you are. And what I realized over time is that in and of itself becomes a role model because people aspire then to be and do things like you're doing. And so I think that definition over time for me has changed. I think I'm grateful. I know I'm grateful that I can be a role model to so many people who ask me questions about, everything from how did you get engaged to cyber? How do you do it? Is it hard? Has it been a struggle? To the empowering parts. How do we get more women like you? How do we try to figure out the aspect of your resilience in the marketplace? And so I do think there's lots of positive weight that comes from a role model. And I think the more conscious we can be about it, the more impact we can potentially have on others. And again, I would say others in both, regardless of the diversity, simply that it's all of our responsibility.
You know what you said? Well, first of all, I can kind of relate to everything you said, and I've seen it with your leadership style. But I think there's a few really important things that you said. One is just the authenticity that you bring to work. I think people actually like to know who they're working with. And the more that you're yourself and the more that you're transparent, the easier it is to work with people. So I love that. And I've seen it. And then your notion of just hard work, and that's what got you to where you are. But you said one thing that I'd love to get your thoughts on, and that's the vulnerability piece. Because what I find is when leaders tend to be more vulnerable within business, it actually helps them create better relationships with people because they could relate to them much better. So to me, that's almost, while the transparency and authenticity is important, the vulnerability, I think, was what allows you to take it to the next level. From a relationship perspective. I don't know if you've seen that as well, or if you want to comment on it.
Yeah, no, I agree. And again, I think as I've, just myself grown up over time, you think about what that means and in your place in life. And it's interesting because I think we all have the opportunity to reflect on things that happen in our lives and how we end up where we end up. And there's a number of things that have impacted my life. One of which it's interesting, I was all the breaches that happen every single day and the fact that me with clients, need to be reserved and ready to help our clients and dive in at a moment's notice and really work through the situation. And it's interesting to have been with a colleague, who knows me very well here at Deloitte, who I also travel with quite a bit. And this colleague said to me one day, he goes, Deb, I've watched you in breaches talking with clients. He's like, you're calm, you're cool. You can get through any situation. You're putting people through this. He goes, I see you traveling sometimes. He's like, also calm and cool, but we miss a flight. He's like, and all of a sudden you're like, okay, I'm going to go into planning action. I'm going to get us from point A to point B. We're going to solve these problems. And, it's interesting because we don't often think about what causes us to have these strengths. And in that instance, obviously, it was the breach strength and being able to get through crisis. And for me, partly to be vulnerable and to understand why that is for me. My mother died while I was quite young, and I think came to a crossroads of, how do you survive in such a difficult situation? And I share that story because obviously it's a little bit of me being vulnerable by sharing that story, but also how do you take strength and character from situations in the past that really do influence who you are? And until this person said this to me, I had never really stopped to think, wow, you know what, you're right. Because at the time when my mom was very sick and the time that after she passed, I did have to figure out how to get through life as a teenager, as a young adult, as someone who got married and had kids, and all the things that you would think about with a parent. And yet the ability to be resilient and to continue to function in a very successful way, really leveraging that strength in business is interesting to me, to see how vulnerable situations and sharing that with people really could turn into a strength that now I'm like, wow, I know now why I'm really good at this, and just put me into those situations because it's something I can continue to do at such a high pace.
So I think we have something in common because I lost my mom when I was 20. And I oftentimes say that life event had the biggest impact on who I am. I'm guessing it's probably similar for you based on what you just said.
Yeah, absolutely. My mom died when I was 18. She was sick from 14 to 18. So yes, very, very similar timeline.
So Deb, cyber is everywhere. That's what we say. And I would say beyond kind of the interesting and nice branding, which I totally love, what does that mean? So if you were to say that to a client, what does cyber everywhere really mean to you?
So I mean, this is going to sound really corny, but it really is everywhere. And so when you think about what that means, so where we are in today's day and age with mobility, if you will, nothing is constrained, if you will, within the four walls. It used to be that when you went to work, when you went home, even if you had devices at home, everything was connected and hardwired inside those four walls, inside your house, inside your office. Now, as we think about where we are today, I mean, obviously 180 degrees different. We've got drones, we've got mobile devices, we've got medical devices, we've got autonomous vehicles. We have so many things, if you will, inside our environment that are connected to our lives every single day. And with each of those, there is a cyber component. And so the theme of cyber everywhere is truly that with cyber in every aspect of what we do, how do we A, best understand it, and then B, make sure we're prepared to not only deal with it, and I don't mean that in a negative way, I actually mean it in a very proactive way, understanding what we need to do to protect ourselves, and then candidly to be resilient and recover when things go wrong. And that could be a breach, that could be an outage, that could be a failure. Just knowing that all of these devices, large or small, connected or remote, do have components of cyber within them, as well as, I would argue, some aspects of privacy and data retention that go along with that as well.
So building off on that, we at Deloitte recently did a cyber survey, and we found while executives understand the importance of cyber, not everything is being secured. And why do you think that is? Do you think it's maybe a lack of understanding about the pervasiveness of cyber, or something else? What do you think is underneath that?
You know, I think it's a little bit of glassy-eyed syndrome. I think people are also, they hear cyber is everywhere and it becomes almost unattainable. So there's so much cyber everywhere. The threat landscape continues to expand. The adversaries are getting faster, quicker, better, smarter. Where do I even start? And so I think it's the challenge of not being overwhelmed by all the ways that the attacks and the threats could be coming at you, that our clients need help sometimes trying to figure out, how do we find, it's not just the one needle in the haystack, it's got to be the 10 or the 15 or the 20 needles in the haystack, but it's not the thousands. And yep. I tend to find that when I talk to my clients, a lot of them just become very overwhelmed and believe that everything needs to be secured in the same fashion. And that's also, you know, a difference where we would say having a risk-based approach, right? So all risks aren't created equal, all threats aren't created equal. Right. Understanding that portfolio of kind of the threats with an overlay on the risks to figure out how you kind of move forward. I think that's why people get hamstrung. I think the other thing is, with technology moving at such a quick pace, whether that's digital, whether that's IoT, or even just agile development and the way that we do development, I think there's also some level of uncertainty of how do you move cyber integration into these components at equally a quick pace to not slow down the business. I think there's some misnomers that by integrating and taking the time to understand the cyber components, we quote unquote slow down the business. I think there's ways to move through that. So you're addressing cyber through the development process or through the technology enablement, versus I think what historically happens is at the end or when a breach happens and then it's too late.
Yeah, it's interesting that you talk about there's so much to focus on. Sometimes people become paralyzed, and it's almost like that whole notion of paradox of choice. When you have too many options, you
Right.
can't make a decision. And I think what you're saying is companies oftentimes or executives get stymied because there's so many areas that you can focus on. And your point is, yes, there is, but you need to take more of a risk-based approach and focus your energy on the stuff that really matters.
Yeah, and I think the other thing too, and this is not a new challenge, is how do technology and business work together, and then overlay that with the executive management and the board.
Right.
I think that all of them need to come together and understanding when is tech talk the right talk, when is business talk the right talk, when are
Mm.
status and dashboarding the right talk. I think having that complement of information so that cyber and technology become enablers of the business, and that business really is driving the decision in the direction, but it has to be supported. And because cyber is everywhere, when a financial attack happens or when someone's trademark, application system is hacked, or you name the system, that becomes very quickly a business issue, right? So how do we deal with it? What are the financial implications? What are the market implications, operations, financial, et cetera, et cetera? What's the technology? The technology has to solve it. We've got to figure out where the hole was.
Right.
We have to patch it. We have to move on. But the implications really are on the business side. And I think that's where we're starting to see more and more coming together, if you will, of those components, so that we're not necessarily just always talking tech talk. We're talking about the impact of the business and quite candidly, how we might be able to positively enable the business.
Right. And it sounds like what you're saying is if you're a business leader and you're starting a project, you need to get the cyber resources in there from the outset, so that it's factored in and addressed throughout the entirety of the project versus after the fact, which I see on some of my clients still happens to this date.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. And I think, after the fact, I mean, yeah, we could say maybe it was faster, maybe, and by the way, faster could be a minute, it could be an hour. I mean,
Right.
again, I think that the nomenclature that's used is often confusing, but when a breach happens or when the technology is so advanced, drone security as an example, or, facial recognition, there absolutely needs to be some accountability for the cyber components in that. And if you can work in the beginning in the design and the requirements and the development stages, even in agile development, so even when you're working in week increments, not months or year increments, that's going to help better protect the foundation that's being built to support whatever those business initiatives are.
Absolutely. So let's pivot to the CISO. It obviously seems like a tough job. It's interesting because I think my few clients are going through a CISO transition right now, and it seems like the shelf life of a CISO is getting shorter and shorter. I don't know if that's true or not, but it's certainly the anecdotal evidence that I see. What do you think are some of the challenges that CISOs are facing nowadays?
I really do think some of it is just this plethora of threats that are coming at us, and I think it's really easy and sometimes unfortunate just to always point the finger back at the CISO. I mean, if you think of everything we were just talking about and all the business and everything that relies on this foundation, and then a breach happens. And here's the thing with the breach, any breach, I think we all need to be cognizant of the fact that breaches will happen. So
Yep.
it's not a matter of if a breach is going to happen, the breach is going to happen. And so I think the mindset needs to be, when the breach happens, how are we best able to recover and respond? And in my experience, the quicker that we can recover and respond, or our clients can recover and respond, the better adept the environment and the organization is. And I think that CISOs end up getting the brunt of this situation because obviously it ends up turning into a technology situation. How did the breach happen? How do we uncover it? What are we doing? And I think there's just a wear and tear on the CISO, candidly, quite a bit. And so I still go back to, how do you, as a CISO, manage all of the cyber threats that we're talking about, and then still look at it from an operational standpoint when, candidly, most of the budgets are shrinking.
Right.
We're seeing shrinking budgets around cyber and technology. We know workforce is an issue. We know the cyber workforce is non-existent, candidly, and so the charge for talent continues to be a struggle. So you put all these requirements in the CISO organization. You've got a high stress, high demand, high threat, low workforce. You can see where the stress comes, and so there's no doubt in my mind that our CISOs have quite a big challenge, continue to have quite a big challenge in front of them. I think it's been there for quite some time and candidly just continues to grow.
Is there one or two things you would say, or you do say, because you come in contact with new CISOs all the time, as they're planning or thinking about their transition, which I think is actually one of the most stressful times in anyone's career? Is there one or two things that you say, here's what you absolutely need to focus on in order for you to be successful?
Yeah, I mean, I really do talk quite a bit on this risk-based approach because there just really is too much to do. And usually people transitioning in means that there was
Yep.
something that happened before. And again, whether
Right.
that's breach or overspend or a project was done poorly or implementation was stalled, usually there's a transition, for a reason that was caused by something. And so I do stress quite a bit this notion of a risk-based portfolio, simply to help understand the tranches of cyber, understanding the operations and the impact that we have associated with that. So that is one, is really understanding that risk portfolio. And I think when you talk to people, executives, boards, et cetera, in that risk framework, they get it. When you talk about it in the extent of we have 100,000 vulnerabilities and these are high
Yep.
and these are medium and these are low, I think you start to lose the broader organization. It's not because people aren't smart. It's because everybody wants to know the so what moment. So what does this matter? Why is it important to us? And so focusing in on that risk-based approach. I think the other thing that I talk to CISOs about is trying to come up with, once you understand that portfolio, items that you can succeed with in chunks of time. So typically, whether it be a technology implementation or a business, transformation, usually it's like months, years. And so how do you create projects that support those that you can show success in shorter increments of time? One, because you need people to get on board. And again, not in a negative way. The more people can see that cyber is enabling these facets, the quicker they're going to be like, yeah, I want that person. Yeah, I see how they were able to help me. So I think that's critical. The other thing is that as these technologies change or as these business imperatives change too, the CISOs are involved and educated so they can make some value decisions on where do I spend the short amount of money that I have or the short amount of talent that I have to make sure that the people, the time, and the energy are focused in the right places.
Yeah, Deb, one of the things you're really hitting on is this kind of alignment between, I'll just call it like cyber approach or strategy with the overall business strategy. And one of the things I see in the areas that I practice is oftentimes the risk executives that put what they do better in the context of the overall organization's goals are oftentimes more successful. Do you have any thoughts on what CISOs or others in this area should do as it relates to kind of positioning cyber in the context of what matters overall to the organization?
Yeah, I mean, it should be high. I mean, the number of people, clients and organizations who come to us today and say, cyber is number 1, 2, or 3 for the board. Can you come talk to our board? Can you come understand? And so I think having the visibility at the board level is amazing, right? We've been talking about wanting to be important for a long time. And so having cyber at the board visibility level is great. And so I think having, like I said, the CISOs being able to articulate the challenges of cyber in a way that enable the board to understand where do we put our money, what lens should we look at. I think there's more important conversations at the board because at the end of the day, what happens, everybody becomes distracted by the complex technology symptoms, as opposed to asking and making better informed cyber risk decisions. What's the type of visibility? Is it good visibility? Is it bad visibility? How accurately do we even measure cyber risk? I think these are some of the questions that need to be defined in a broad way so that when you are having the conversation at the board or at the executive level, it helps people put them into context. Because I do think that things outside of the CISO shop, outside of the technology shop, start to, like I said earlier, get kind of glassy-eyed, right? So I think if you can put some of the questions back into the basics, it becomes much more digestible at various levels throughout the organization, including the board.
Yeah, one of the things that I always tell my clients, not necessarily from a cyber perspective, but just when you're positioning this stuff, just go back to what they're talking about at the board or executive meetings and get the materials that they're sharing with each other. You'll figure out quickly how they speak, the way that they look at things. And I think by integrating cyber or any other risk into that type of context is helpful, because the challenge, I think what it ultimately comes down to is board members and executives see the world a bit differently. And so rather than hoping that they're going to come to you, you need to actually elevate up to the way that they think. And once you can do that and speak in their language, I find it to be that much more effective. Changes the game.
Yeah, I mean, well said. And again, I think the board can absolutely understand cyber risk without having to be the most sophisticated technologists, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the things, Deb, you said earlier is that it's not if, it's when a potential breach is going to happen. What advice do you have for organizations to prepare for the ultimate breach that may happen? Is there any simple things that companies can do?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I talk quite a bit about is wargaming. So one of the things is, how do you become best prepared for a breach or something that you don't know what's going to happen? And so we do quite a bit around what I'll call cyber breach wargaming, which is literally, playing a game, playing a war game. And it's organized around the business and it's organized around the technology. And this is often something, and why I suggest people pay attention to these types of war games, because it really does help you prepare for a cyber attack. And it does it, again, not just from the technology vantage point. So when we do wargaming, it includes the executives, it includes marketing and legal and finance. It includes all the things so that you have a much better thought out response, which will be much more impactful when the actual attack happens. And so I think being able to do that, and candidly getting boards and senior executives involved in that as well. So when someone says, are we ready for an attack? The war game is going to test your readiness. And not only is it going to test your readiness, it's going to do it in a point where it's not a point of panic. Because when the breach is happening, it's a point of panic. What do I need to do immediately? How do I need to get there? As opposed to perhaps doing a war game in advance, which the games, by the way, mimic very, very much so real life, attacks and will keep you kind of moving. And it's not the traditional penetration testing. So it's not trying to attack from a technology perspective. It's really organized around businesses, business scenarios. Like I said, simulating the experience of a real attack. So when things happen, who do you need to talk to? How do you need to operate? What systems need to go down? Is legal impacted? Do we need to make a media response? So there's lots of things that come into play, and how quickly some of these things occur that I do believe, and what I recommend often is take the time to do the war game so that you can ultimately yield the insights into a breach without actually having a breach occur, and then be prepared and ready for when the breach actually does happen.
So this is something that I talk to clients a lot about. One of the challenges I oftentimes have is, oh my gosh, I totally agree. If there's a breach, we need to be prepared. It's just not one of our number one priorities today. So how do you get executives to quote unquote buy into doing a war game when they've got 1,000 other things that are priorities and they kind of delay it until the inevitable happens? Is there anything that you've seen that works to get them engaged when it's not their number one priority?
Yeah, one of the things is the fact that when we're asked this question at the boards. So the boards do ask this question quite a bit, and broadly, candidly, just are we ready for an attack? And my follow-up answer to that is, well, have you done a war game? Because I don't know how you actually answer that question completely without actually understanding where your, I'll call them vulnerabilities, but I don't mean system vulnerabilities, where your organizational vulnerabilities rely. And so that has been one area. The other thing that I've talked to clients about is maybe you don't have to do a cyber war game for your entire infrastructure, but let's say I'm talking to a hospital system. I'll ask the hospital system, what CISO or the executive, what is your most critical application? And I actually have a very, very specific scenario in my head, multi-tenant hospital system around the US. Their response was, Deb, we rely on our medical devices. And so my response back was, well, what happens if those medical devices go down? And
Yeah.
the audible silence of the what do you if it happens we'll be ready, and it's a little bit of stumbling, and I'm like, okay, well, what do you mean by you'll be ready? Can you explain that to me? Walk me through what ready would be. And what they tend to do is walk through in their minds, like the backup and recovery plan. And so again, you hate to sit there and say, well, let me just peel apart everything that you're saying, but when somebody walks through the backup and recovery plan, the second thing I say is, what year was that dated, and when's the last time you actually tested it?
That's good. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think there's ways to get people to understand it. And basically that scenario showcases, find the mission critical. What is mission critical?
Right.
You don't need to war game every application and every system and every environment that you have, but what is critical to your mission? And then how do you make sure that that system, that thing, that environment is protected in a way that if it were to go down, if something were to compromise it, you're prepared to stand back up and continue moving. And I think when you look at any of the breaches, large or small, that have happened, those that have had less damage have been the ones that have been able to recover in a shorter period of time.
This goes back to the comments that you were making at the beginning about a risk-based approach. It's not that you need to solve it for everything, but it's the things that truly are critical to the organization. Figure that out, do a war game, plan for it, and then you can respond appropriately. But I think that's an important point, because I do think oftentimes people make the issue, because it is such an important issue, not bigger than it is, but they don't necessarily attack it from a risk-based approach. And I think that's really good counsel that you're giving to everybody, both in terms of planning, but then also making sure that you're ready if a breach actually does happen. What if, Deb, what if something happens that's bad, like a breach, but they didn't do any of that? What would you then say? Because I'm sure you brought into a lot of client instances where they've had an incident and they were not prepared. Is there guidance that you would give to organizations if they didn't do the proper planning, but now they're facing an incident? What would you tell them to do?
Yeah, and I mean, look, that happens probably more times than not. I mean, it's unfortunate. I think there's a number of steps of things you should do, of typical types of incident response, if you will. So, if being prepared didn't happen via a war game, you want to get to immediate, identification of the root cause. How do you contain the situation? How do you eradicate the issue? How do you recover? And then ultimately, what lessons have you learned from the situation? And, those are traditional, incident response. And I think regardless of the size and the breadth of the breach, those types of steps will occur, right? And I think the difference is as you start to recover and peel back the layers of the onion, so as you're in identification or containment, other things may start to happen. And that's kind of where I went on, hey, is this so big that the press is going to find out about it? Do we need to look at press releases? Or is it taking other systems down? Or do we need to take this system down? Is it a ransomware attack? And now we need to think about, are we going to pay the ransom? And so there's a number of what if scenarios. And so I think the biggest thing as you're working through kind of these scenarios of incident response is communication. And that is both internal with your IT and cyber teams, but also with your business and executive management team, as well as the other constituents that, again, may come into play. So whether that's marketing or contracting or PR, legal, et cetera, I think having that communication and making sure that you could recover again through these types of situations as you're investigating, as you're notifying, as you're restoring, communication underscores any of those steps, regardless of where you are in the process.
So let's move to the comment that you made earlier, that I think you said the bad guys are getting faster, better, smarter. What would you recommend to companies around how they find the threats that really do matter? And you've talked a lot about the risk-based approach, obviously, but are there any tools, techniques, things that organizations should be thinking about to find where these threats actually lie?
Yeah, I mean, so I think 100% analytics needs to be leveraged. There's so much data out there. So the good news is, with all the transformation, everything going digital, everything's in the cloud. I'm exaggerating slightly, but you understand that the amount of data is getting larger and larger and larger that's available. And so how do we use that data to actually help us find those needles in the haystack? And I strongly encourage not only the use of data, because one could also argue you take a lot of data, you consolidate the data, and then you just have bigger reports or more reports or different reports that you now have to look at. And instead, what I like to encourage our clients to do, and what we do, we have solutions built around this, is to use things like behavioral analytics. How would the adversary be thinking? What are traits that we could predict that would occur in these scenarios so that we could start to hone in? So instead of telling someone who maybe has a broken bone, go get an x-ray and hope they figure it out, being able to at least get them to, hey, I think the broken bone is in your hand. Now go get the x-ray on your hand. And that's really what things like behavioral analytics and big data analytics helps us provide in the cyber world. And there really is no stopping to be able to do that and to be able to quickly see where some of these threats are. Because again, there's thousands of threats that are happening, and we have nation states that are paying people to try and infiltrate the United States, right? We have whole countries doing that. We have actors doing that. There's more and more people that are trying to target the clients in the United States, our organizations, ourselves, right? As human beings are trying to do it to gain access to our personal information. And I think the best way to try and weed through all that data is to use things like artificial intelligence and analytics to be able to help us hone in a little bit more on those higher risk items.
So Deb, if I'm a executive or a board member, I'm going to pivot a little. So not as a cyber leader, but if I'm a executive or board member, I don't have a deep understanding of cyber. I get it. I get the risk. What questions should I be asking my CISO or CIO? Like, what are one or two questions that you think are critical that they ask?
So I think one really important one is first of all, how do we consistently define cyber? I think cyber means a lot of things to a lot of people, and it's often mischaracterized depending upon who you talk about. So I think one question has to be, are we actually defining it and talking about it the same way? I think the other thing that has to be asked, absolutely, is are we also measuring that successfully and consistently? And so I think that comes into, are we actually defining it and measuring it in a way that helps us understand the threats that face our company? And it can be that basic, because I think that is the question. And then I think the follow-up question comes to that is, okay, then once we have a good idea of that, how do we make sure that we're actually mitigating against that? And what things are we doing to mitigate against it? And, I think sometimes people want to paint a very solid picture of the mitigation strategies. I think for executives, it behooves all of us to maybe ask the second and third follow-up question. And again, you don't have to be the techie, you don't have to really quote unquote understand cyber, but maybe digging a little bit deeper so it's not just a paper exercise, right? It has to really understand, is it incorporated into the whole company? So I give an easy example. Phishing attacks still seems to be one of the largest ways that adversaries infiltrate our organizations. And you could ask the question, well, something as simple as that, have there been plans in an organization to do communication, education, trials, sending out, phishing attacks on purpose to see who's clicking it, and then educating and making sure we don't repeat behavior? That is one of the most common questions as an executive I would ask, because what normally happens is that organizations aren't learning from the incidences that continue to happen. So if a organization has had, 3 phishing attacks, what have they done to make sure that they don't have the 4th one? Or what are they doing to learn from that? And I think that's something that we repeatedly see from time to time, actually candidly quite often, because they're patching the hole. And again, I don't mean literally patching the security vulnerability. I mean, the breach happens, an issue happens, they find it, they plug the hole. They're like, okay, great, we can move on. Well, really, what are your lessons learned, and how have you fixed, quote unquote, the environment so that same problem doesn't continue to happen somewhere else?
That's some great advice, especially kind of the postmortem, the lessons learned, because that's something that executives or a board can really get into, and they'll understand fairly quickly if you just patch it or if there's been a substantive change that's been made. So I think that's some good advice. What we're going to do is move into what I like to call kind of rapid fire questions. So I'm going to throw a bunch of questions at you, and you can answer them really quickly, and then we'll be concluded. So let's just talk about, and we already have gotten into this, but I almost want to take this from a human perspective, because one of the things that I know that you're very focused on beyond just your professional responsibilities is well-being. So given the fact that there are enormous pressures on CISOs, do you have any advice for them, and quite frankly, any professional that is being inundated by messages, that has a lot of stress at work, anything that you would recommend people do to deal with all of this stress that we've got in our lives?
Yeah, so it's going to sound really easy and easier said than done, which is find a
Yeah,
moment to decompress. And even for myself, as busy as it is, you've got to find that moment, because here's the thing too, when you think about it, the best ideas don't come when you're strapped to a desk. It doesn't come when you're on the 18th hour of continuous conference calls. It comes to
yep,
you when you're in the shower or when you wake up from your sleep at some, ungodly time. And I actually have Post-its next to my bed so I can write things down. It comes to you when you're relaxed and your brain is thinking about something different other than the stresses of what it's in currently. And so, when you think about that too, best athlete, right? You've got pinch hitters. Pinch hitters don't play the whole game. They come in when you need them, right? And so they're
right.
rested and they're prepared and they're ready to go when they need to perform that job. I think oftentimes because we're under such stress and because we're all working lots of hours, we think our brain should just keep being able to go. And I think at some juncture, we have to recognize that our brain and our bodies will not continue to just quote unquote keep going. We need to figure out
Yep,
how to refresh them. And that doesn't mean you need, I always hear people say, well, I don't have enough time for that. So what I
yep.
often, my little tidbit of ways to find time, I tell people to write on a piece of paper at the top of the paper, 1, 3, 5, 15. And those are for minutes. And then create a list of the things you can do in a 1 minute, in a 3 minute, in a 5 minute, or a 15 minute that will have you relax or take your brain off of something that is currently happening. In a minute, you can call someone and tell them you love them. In a minute, you
Yep.
can watch a funny video. In a minute, I could pet my dog. So the point being is that you don't need hours. You don't need an hour. You don't need even a half an hour. You can take the time, i.e. a minute, and actually recharge your brain. And so I encourage people all the time to not put the constraint of, I don't have time, or it's too difficult, or I'm so stressed, I don't know how to unstress. And when you have that 1, 3, 5, 15 on your wall, in your iPhone, it's really easy to look at it and be like, oh my gosh, I have a minute, what can I do? And
What can I
so,
do?
right, so just encouraging people to find those moments, to take 3 deep breaths, because that takes less than a minute, by the way, to find those moments and recharge yourself, because just like a battery, we all need recharging. And if we don't, at some point, our bodies and our minds will definitely give up.
Deb, I love like thinking about things that I could do to be more productive, and I have never heard of this 1, 3, 5, 15. So thank you, because there is. I mean, everybody's always got a minute or 2 or 3 or 5 or 15, whatever it may be, and to actually be thoughtful about that in advance, so that when you do find that minute, you actually can go to strategies that you've already thought about. Part of the challenge is we just don't think about it. So when we've got that free time, we don't do anything with it.
Right. And again, we often use the excuse, I just don't have the time. And when you're,
Right.
by the way, the first time I did this exercise, which was now years ago, I was amazed at how many things I could do in 1 minute or 3 minutes that would literally get me
Totally.
disconnected from work. And the lists were long. And it's not even that you had to repeat something often. It's like, wow, I can do all these things in a minute or 3 minutes. And it really helps to just take that quick moment off of the stress that's happening. So maybe you can clear your mind. Maybe you can move a little bit further. Maybe you can just take a breath and realize that, there are more important things, i.e. yourself.
Right.
The other anecdote that someone told me long ago, I mean, we travel a lot, obviously, for our jobs. Every time you get on a plane, listen very, very closely to the announcement. It always tells you to put your mask on before helping others. And if you don't take that moment to help yourself, you and I will not be here for anyone else. And so I think it's incredibly important. I heard that probably 10 years ago, and every single time I get on a plane now, when I hear that, it resonates for me again, and it reminds me how important taking care of myself is so that I can be there for my loved ones.
So next question is, how are we getting young people, and I was going to say especially girls, but I think your point earlier was it's everybody, but more interested in cyber. Is there anything that we're doing as a firm, or you're seeing as an industry or associations? What's going on out there?
Yeah, I think simply, I mean, there's a number of things, right? I mean, I think one of it is just simply the advancement of cyber into K through 12 programs. I mean, we're seeing much more than ever before. I mean, there's now, cyber degrees, there's now obviously STEM, particularly girls in STEM, girls who code, a number of activities that continue to escalate. I think the other thing is that, we're seeing people when you say, what do you want to be when you grow up? When I have young girls look at me and say, I want to go to the moon, or I want to be a doctor, or I want to do, you listen. And then when you start to talk to them, like I said, even in the beginning, when we said cyber is everywhere, even when they're talking about, well, what do you want to do when you go to the moon? Or what do you want to do when you are a doctor? They want to solve such complex problems, and it's amazing and it's fascinating. And I think just the more that we talk to kids, the more that we talk to teenagers, the more that we talk to ourselves about how to leverage that desire, critical thinking, interest, excitement, that everybody doesn't fall into the same box. The interest and just the growth in K through 12, the growth that we're seeing in other organizations and ecosystems that are putting cyber at the forefront of all of these capabilities. So when you talk about, and I've been in the many a school system and the broader ecosystems, and we look at technologies and Silicon Valley or venture capitals, when you're talking to them, it's all about the advancement of tomorrow. And that's in our people, that's in our children, that's in our technology. And I think we have to continue to be full steam ahead on getting the interest and excitement, and certainly in our female population as well, continuing to say that, because there has been this notion that it's a very male dominated, the statistics show us that it's still a very male dominated industry. And so how do we get girls, young girls, K through 12, how do we get females, how do we get individuals interested in this field of cyber? And I still think while we've made great strides, there's still so much more that we can continue to do in this area.
So let's talk about the people that actually work for you. So you do obviously lead a practice of what I would say smart, hungry, and wickedly talented people, which sometimes is difficult to kind of motivate them and get them excited. Is there anything that you have found that works at motivating professionals and people that have, big aspirations and are smart?
Yeah, it's funny because people will even ask me, they're like, how do you stay motivated? I said, I stay motivated by all the people in our practice. And it's a true, a true statement. I mean, you obviously know me, but I mean, I thrive off of ideas. I mean, I thrive off of hearing people. I think the other thing is, how do we encourage all of our staff, but particularly our junior staff? How do you, raise a hand and share an idea, not just share the idea for the sake of hearing it, but what can we do? How can we better ourselves? I'm always looking for a way to better ourselves, better the practice. And that doesn't mean that we're in a bad spot. It's just we all need to continue to evolve. And obviously I've been at the firm, a long time. And the fact that I still have this passion, it's because of our people. I love the challenges that I have. I love our clients, but candidly, as hokey as it sounds, I mean, it truly is the people. And I love the fact that whether I'm sitting with a consultant or a colleague or a PPMD or someone on the board, I am equally engaged and interested in what they have to say. And I think, again, going all the way back to the beginning of our conversation, it truly is about being authentic and transparent. And I think when you can do that with our people and spend time to just listen and ask questions and understand different perspectives, it's invigorating. It's invigorating for me. I think it's invigorating for teams. And candidly, I love it. I mean, somebody was joking with me last week that I'm an old millennial. I'm not sure what to do with that feedback. But they said that. I mean, I ride the electric scooters to and from work, although people have told me maybe that's dangerous. But I mean, I'm safe when I do it. Don't worry. But like, I love to surround myself by different types of people, and sometimes even people who are very different than me, so that I could learn and continue to evolve my own thinking and understanding and education around how we can all come together. And again, I know that sounds really corny, but it truly is the way that I operate. It truly is, why I continue and have continued to stay at Deloitte, is because I love the diversity of the people that we surround ourselves with. That being said, I know we've got challenges. And so I also implore people to raise their hand and bring challenges to me. I talked to somebody last week, they were having a difficult time with a number of things. And they thought that there was the only response was, to leave the firm. And, I said, let's try and figure out if there's another answer. Let's figure out if there's a different way to attack this problem. And I'm proud to say that we did, and we were able to work a different resolve. But how do we encourage more people to have the conversations? Look, I know it's easy to go find another job. I mean, I still get people calling me wanting jobs and offering things. And at the end of the day, I think if we could all be a little bit more transparent in what we're trying to achieve personally and professionally, I think it'll go a long way for us. And I sincerely mean that. So everybody who knows me knows, door wide open, like, let's talk about the good things and the challenges, because that's what's going to make us a better practice and a better organization, candidly.
Yeah, you've said something that I believe to the core of who I am, and that is going back to this people comment question, is people just want to be heard. I mean,
Right.
honestly, like, and I think that's one of the reasons why people leave organizations, is because they're not being heard, they're not being engaged, and it doesn't really matter at what level you're at. And so I think the more that we as leaders or just managers, people with responsibility, just to listen. First of all, there's always a lot of good stuff there, especially from somebody just right out of school. But if you actually engage with people, they'll give you 10 times back, is what I've experienced.
100% agree.
Hey, Deb, what about, this may be a weird or hard question, but is there anything that you've done to change how you lead or engage people based on a learning? I mean, you've been at the firm like I have quite some time, and I could absolutely say there are things that, if I could wind the clock back 15, 20, 25 years, I absolutely would do. Yesterday was my 25th anniversary at Deloitte, so I could say 25 years. I didn't get my gold watch, but I'm just teasing. But is there something that you've learned over your career where you say, you know what, I've changed that because of a learning that I've got?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. I mean, one, my own motto for myself is that I'm perfectly imperfect. And I love that I've been able to evolve my thinking to get there, right? And what I mean by that is that I don't strive to be perfect. I don't strive to accomplish everything. I don't strive to have things be my way or the highway. But I think some of that is learned over time, right? And so I think part of that is allowing yourself, candidly, to forgive yourself and to move forward, which I think at times is very difficult for us, depending upon where we are in our lives, professionally or personally. And so for me, as I think about, my evolution, kind of been there, done that, it's really understanding the mechanics of, A, we're all people. B, we're usually harder on ourselves than anyone is on us. And so how do you work through the things that you have, realizing that it also takes two to tango. And so if there is some sort of challenge happening and you're involved in it and you look at it and you say, well, it's all you, it can't possibly be the case because it takes two to tango. And so maybe something you're inadvertently doing or thinking of. And so I really challenged myself to kind of be able to look at those things from that perspective and say, look, I know I'm saying something and it's not being heard, as an example. Maybe it's the way I'm saying it. Maybe it has nothing else to do with anything else. And so how do I tweak, not necessarily what I stand for or what I mean or what I'm trying to do, but maybe there's a different way I need to present myself or a different way that I need to communicate, so that we can move forward. And the other thing is when you do that, you have to also be willing to fail at some things. And so I think just for me, it's been an evolution of failure actually is good. Like understanding what it is and learning from it and moving on is very important in how we need to evolve ourselves. And so again, for me, while it wouldn't necessarily be, I would change these 55 things, I think I've just evolved the way that I think about approaching life in general. And some of that includes, I'm perfectly imperfect. Part of that includes forgiving myself and continuing to move forward in life. And the other part of that really is, like I said, being okay with failure, learning quickly from it and moving forward.
Man, that is good. So I only have one last question. We could have almost ended it there because that was so good. But we did name this podcast Resilient. And so I always ask whoever is on, what are the attributes, in your opinion, of a resilient leader? I guess it's a two-part question. And is there anybody that just stands out in your life? And quite frankly, it could be personal, professional, whoever. But once again, attributes of a resilient leader and who stands out for you.
I mean, it's funny. I'm taking a deep breath as you say that, because resilience is the ability to leverage your grit, and I call it grit factor, being able to leverage your grit, whatever that grit is, to continue to push forward in an ever-changing world. And so I do think the more self-aware that people can be around that grit, and again, turning it into a positive. I mean,
Yep.
there's not, it's very difficult for me to say that my mother's death was a positive, because obviously it had a very, very big impact in my life. But when I can think about the resilience it gave me, the grit it gave me, the ability for me to continue forward every day, despite how sad or despite how impossible it felt at the moment, to me, it's understanding those grit factors really well in yourself and then figuring out how to use them in your personal and professional careers. And so to me, resilience can mean lots of different things to people based on those grit factors, but I do firmly believe that there are a lot of people who have those grit factors and maybe they just don't know yet. And so my advice to people would be figure out what your grit is, and candidly, you might be more resilient than you think.
Absolutely. Deb, I really want to thank you. It's interesting that you mentioned your mother's death wasn't a blessing, but it's almost exactly the way that I took it. It literally changed, I think, who I was as a person, and changed the trajectory of where I was going within my life. And so I do think sometimes there are things that happen either professionally or personally in your life that, like you said, you can learn from, you can apply, and just be a better person. And it sounds like both you and I had that probably biggest life event ever in our life, and we're able to kind of bounce back as a result of it. But I want to thank you very, very much, and almost recognize you. I was writing words down that kind of embody who you are when you were speaking, and I wrote down things like pragmatic, self-aware, smart, real, passionate, grit, and I think a lot of these words, and there's a lot more, but I think they embody who you are as a leader, and I think we are unbelievably lucky to have you as a leader in the firm. I usually don't try to talk about Deloitte because this is not about Deloitte, but I will say we are very lucky to have you as a leader, not only from a cyber perspective, but somebody that I know a lot of people look up to. So thank you. And also thank you very much. You're going to be doing a few of these resilient podcasts where you're going to be interviewing some folks. And so I appreciate you doing that as well. I think, and now that everybody's gotten exposed to you, they're probably going to be looking more forward to listening to your interviews than mine. So thank you very much. So Deb, you are awesome. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity today. It's been the highlight of probably my day/week. So I really do appreciate it. And I look forward to the upcoming ones where I get to lead a very similar conversation. You are in and of yourself a great role model to be having such an easy conversation with. So I appreciate you for giving me the opportunity to do this today.
Wow, that was incredible, Deb. Thank you very much for your time. I know you're extremely busy. I'm just about to jump on a flight to Israel. And I want to thank everybody who subscribes and listens to Resilient, a Deloitte podcast produced by our friends at Rivet Smart Audio. You can find us at Deloitte.com or visiting your favorite podcatcher, iTunes, SoundCloud, Google Play, and even Spotify, keyword resilient. And check out our previous episodes. And if you liked what you heard today, check out my conversation with Rob Lee, who shared his thoughts around cyber risks in IoT and industrial control systems. And if you're enjoying these conversations, share it with your friends, family, colleagues, anybody that you think would enjoy it. And I would be extremely grateful if you just take 1 minute and go to one of your podcatchers, wherever you're listening, and just provide a rating. It provides such an impact on really exposing Resilient to others out there. And if you have any comments, questions, or recommendations for future guests, hit me up on LinkedIn or Twitter. On Twitter, I'm mkearney33. And once again, any recommendations, thoughts, or future guests. So I love to end these conversations with a quote that really sum up the guest. And here's a quote that when I think about Deb, it really exemplifies who she is. It goes as follows: there is no elevator to success. You have to take the stairs.